Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Jacobs in the Education Department at GBH. I want to remind you, please, in the chat to make sure that your chat is set for everyone rather than hosts and panelists so everyone can see your responses. I think the default is host and panelists, and every time we run a webinar, I remember that I should change that in the settings. I haven't done that yet, but I'm going to do that this time. So please change it to everyone so that we can all see your responses. Thank you, Sue, Alicia, and Lindsay. Again, welcome everyone. We know that some of you are just starting school. Some of you have been in school for a while. School weeknights are always tough, and we know that we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I'm calling you from my home in Southern Maine, but I work at GBH Education in Boston. We are recording tonight, and we will be sending out the link to the recording along with a very robust resource document and a link to the slides, etc., tomorrow in an email. And you'll also get all of those links on a slide later on in the presentation, and I'll be posting links in the chat also. We are using Zoom webinar as our platform, which means that only the presenters have the microphone and are on camera. And I will be in the chat posting links, and the presenters will also be in the chat as they see fit when they're not presenting. We'll try to get to your questions during the presentation. We have reserved some time at the end. Next slide, please. GBH was previously known as WGBH, and it's Boston's public media station, and the creator of many of the, all of the iconic series that you see on this screen and many more. We know that American experience is very near and dear to social studies teachers, and all of these programs are available on your local PBS station. Next slide, please. In the education department, we have been producing resources for both in the classroom and out of the classroom, for example, museums or libraries or boys and girls clubs for over 40 years. We create media resources and programs, and we give everything away. Along with PBS, GBH co-founded the service PBS LearningMedia. And this is public media's platform, digital library for teachers and students. It offers thousands of free resources for K-12 across the curriculum. And we hope that we encourage you to explore the site if you haven't already. Next slide, please. This is what the homepage looks like. Again, it's pbslearningmedia.org. You can create an account, which takes about 30 seconds. Again, it's free, or you're welcome to explore the site without logging in. If you do log in, which we encourage you to do so, you're then going to see your own state standards. You're going to be able to share resources with students through Google Classroom and other platforms, and you can download resources, etc. So there's a lot of advantages to logging in. Next slide, please. Many of you submitted questions with your registration form and also suggestions for topics for webinars, and we really appreciate you doing that. We take your suggestions very seriously, and the presenters have seen the questions, and I'm compiling the list of the topics, and there are 3 clear winners, and one of them is Reconstruction, and another one is civil rights, and another one is Indigenous and Native peoples. And we're going to be trying to address a lot of that in this webinar, and then keep that in mind for future webinars. So here we have our presenters, the esteemed social studies team at GBH Education, Sue, Alicia, and Lindsay. All 3 of them are very experienced social studies educators. And in fact, Alicia is still in the classroom. She teaches African American studies in DC public schools, and then she's also on staff with us. The team is led by Sue, and they have done a great job on this webinar, and this is one of many webinars that they have worked on. And all 3 of them are largely responsible for a lot of the resources you're going to see tonight. So I'm very happy to be able to work with them. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Sue.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to review an essential question with you and our session objectives. We will introduce and provide a brief overview of the U.S. History Collection on PBS LearningMedia, in case you're not already familiar with it. And then we're going to take a deeper dive into 3 different challenging topics. As Carolyn mentioned, a few of these were inspired by your questions, so thank you very much. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session.
So I just wanted to take a brief moment to share our objectives for our webinar. Today's webinar was organized around the following essential question. How do we at GBH empower teachers to confidently teach an honest and accurate account of U.S. history that embraces American pluralism during politically challenging times? So tonight, we really hope that you'll take away some tools, resources, and lesson ideas and just bring them immediately back into your classroom. So during this webinar, we'll be reviewing best practices for addressing challenging topics in the classroom. We'll be exploring engaging digital media, these classroom-ready resources from the U.S. History Collection on PBS LearningMedia. They feature stories of diverse people and highlight multiple perspectives, as well as core topics that you would find in a U.S. history curriculum. And we really hope, again, that you're going to take away some great new content and new strategies for teaching these challenging topics. Whether you've been in the classroom already for 4 weeks or you're about to start this week or next week, again, we hope that we can inspire you at the start of the year.
We would like for you to take this time to first ask yourself, what makes teaching U.S. history challenging for you? Please identify your top 2 challenges in the chat. Are you experiencing, too much content, too little time? Is it bringing history alive for my students? Teaching content and skills. For you, are you facing the politicized nature of everything? Or teaching my diverse student learners? Covering the negative and the uplifting parts of history? Is it topics that involve violence, cruelty, and death? Is it making sure all students see themselves in history, or is it addressing current controversial issues? Right, so just looking at the chat, looks like we're all over the place. I definitely see a lot of 1s. I definitely see a lot of 4s. Too much content, too little time. Bringing history, making it alive for my students. Definitely 1, definitely 4, the politicized nature of everything, definitely. And I know that really is kind of dependent sometimes on what state that you're teaching in. I'm seeing a lot of 7s, topics that involve violence, cruelty, and death. Yes, they could be very difficult. And it looks like 9, addressing current controversial issues, are really kind of in the top running.
Great, thanks, Alicia. And thanks for responding to that. That's really helpful for us. What do we mean by challenging times? As Carolyn pointed out, my colleagues and I are all former or current U.S. history teachers, and we know what a challenge teaching U.S. history is. One challenge, of course, is the content, which we know is a lot and only growing as time marches on. And curriculum standards ask for a more inclusive narrative on top of, the core. We really do think that our supplemental resources can help you add core content, multiple perspectives, diverse narratives, and personal stories to your existing curriculum. And this last quote under the content side here, you want to expose students to the good, the bad, and the ugly. It comes from a teacher who he would not characterize himself as a progressive leaning person, but he still believes that it is our obligation to teach students a full understanding of U.S. history. The other way we think about challenging U.S. history is pedagogy. And when teaching these divisive and polarizing topics, it's important to let students know, first of all, that they are not responsible for what happened in the past, but they are responsible for themselves today and tomorrow. And we are going to emphasize again and again tonight how important it is to teach students how to think, not what to think. And we'll share tips for incorporating civil, respectful discussions into your classrooms. that are based on historical facts and evidence, but that also recognize, there's probably a diversity of opinion among your students, and it's important to acknowledge that and respect that, as long as it's sort of informed opinion.
So we also want to take a little bit of time to go over our why. So what is bringing us here tonight? So I think it's just really important to acknowledge that research shows that students who are encouraged to discuss controversial issues are really more likely to develop civic tolerance, political interests, a sense of civic duty, and expectations of voting than their peers without that similar classroom experiences. So as teachers on the front lines, it's really important as we're developing the next generation of citizens to have these conversations, because this is where they're going to take great deep learning and instill that sense of civic duty and a sense of a desire to understand the world around them. Also, avoiding the topic does not make these issues disappear. So if we choose not to engage, we're not necessarily helping our students. In fact, we really need to teach them how to have these difficult conversations, what it is to model a difficult conversation, how do you work through conflict. And by presenting these challenging stories of history, it's going to also give them examples of hope, optimism, resilience, empathy, and deepen their understanding of other experiences.
Now, to begin, it's never recommended that you jump into a challenging lesson without pre-planning and prepping your students. And we have some recommended strategies that you could use beforehand. Number one, create a safe and trusting place in your classroom. Follow culturally responsive pedagogy. Be transparent with your students, your administration, and parents. Inform and seek the input from your colleagues. Let them know, listen, I have a topic that I want to cover. Do you have any input? Or this is how I plan about going about it. What do you think? Educate yourself. Make sure you are aware of current cultural and linguistic pedagogical practices, and avoid teaching a difficult lesson on a Friday. Now, a lot of us are probably like, what? If it's possible, you never want to jump into a difficult topic and say, all right, that's it, guys. See, let it fester over the weekend and I'll see you again on Monday. So these are some things you can keep in mind. So over in the chat, we'd love it if you would tell us, which of these strategies have you used already? We know we have a lot of experienced teachers in the crowd, or which of these strategies have you maybe wanted to try? I love that. First answer is educating myself. I love that. Love it. Love it. Seeing a lot of fives. I love that Brian says, I'm standing by 6, fully avoid teaching a difficult lesson on a Friday. All right. And I got some people, Paul said all of them, 1 through 6. That's what I'm talking about. Great. I love that above all, I'm seeing a lot of ones, creating a safe and a trusting place in your classroom, which is so important. Heather didn't think about number 6, but she plans on doing that as well.
Great, thank you. I do just want to mention these steps, these tips come from an article that we're going to share with you in the resource document that Carolyn will send you the link to at the end of the webinar. And the whole article is really quite helpful, I think. So Alicia talked about like what you do before you start a lesson with a challenging topic, and during the lesson, some tips here: safely in, safely out. That simply means you don't just have the kids come in and sit down and then just knock them over the head with that challenging topic. You need to prepare them for the difficult conversation, and then you don't just let them out the door at the end of class and sort of say, you go home and think about that. You want to give them some opportunity for reflection of some sort. And if possible, you end the lesson with a hopeful message for the future, for sure. Try to teach a comprehensive narrative that takes into account multiple perspectives and diverse experiences. And that is a big part of the U.S. History collection. And I think you'll see that tonight. Anticipate real world connections. I mean, that means sort of be aware of your students' backgrounds and, understanding that what you describe as challenging history may echo or have shaped their lives today. So sort of being aware of that and being open to a student who might want to volunteer their own story. Include individual and personal stories where you can. Prepare for reactions. Students can react, I'm sure, as you know, in very different ways. And sometimes laughter, it seems inappropriate, but it's actually just a reflection of anxiety. And so again, just that safe environment, that safe classroom space, I think helps to let students express themselves in a productive way. And, you all know that you should set a policy of, are you going to let students leave the room? Are you going to let them just take a break in the room if they feel uncomfortable?
It was mentioned in the chat that some teachers have block scheduling schedules where sometimes Friday is their only option to have class. So what I wanted to iterate, when you're ending your lesson, I think one of the first things that you can do, especially if you're in a time crunch, or it seems like, again, it's a Friday and the lesson has kind of taken maybe a sad or challenging or difficult turn, try to end with a hopeful message and think about what that hopeful message can be that's meaningful to students. So for example, if you've taught a really difficult lesson, can you provide your students with an actionable item so they can leave the classroom feeling a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more like they could take charge of fixing or addressing the problem? Or can you end with a historical example where an actionable item led to some good, or to show the optimism in the situation? I think it's also important at the end of a challenging lesson to give students time. They might need to decompress, they might need to reflect, they might not be ready to share their feelings. So I just remember when I was a brand new teacher, I really wanted the kids to talk all the time. So I kind of made the rookie mistake of always badgering them. Sometimes you need that silence and that place for reflection. And along with that, offer your students a different way of communicating. So perhaps it could be some coloring or some doodling. Perhaps it's talking to a partner and working through it in a small group. Maybe it's a small writing exercise. And take cues from your students. They'll let you know. So I would love it if you could take a second to drop in the chat which of these strategies is underutilized in the class, but you think would be beneficial for students and why. So I already see number 2, allowing for reflection. I think that's really wonderful. That I think it's one thing that I often would forget, especially in my early days of teaching, that it takes time to percolate on these ideas. Yes, and with hope, you need to absolutely make sure that we're doing that. Oh, the chat is bursting. I love it. So it looks like we have a lot of 2s and 3s. That 2 and 3 are often underutilized. I remember really learning from students that sometimes they needed to color in order to process and think, and they came up with incredible ideas, and see how you can kind of use those strategies in the classroom. And then we have a bunch saying 1, 2, and 3 that they're all underutilized. So I hope after our webinar, you can go back to your classroom and kind of think, okay, how can I implement one of these? And yes, it can be hard to find optimism, especially if we're thinking about today, but that's why we're hoping to give you some historical examples tonight that you can also percolate on as well. And yes, exit tickets are a great way to do these things.
Great, thank you. All right, so all of the resources we're going to be sharing with you tonight in this webinar come from the U.S. History Collection. We're going to put the link to the collection in the chat. And I am going to go live to the collection right now. Excellent. Okay, so there are over 400 digital resources in the U.S. History Collection, and all of these are free for you and your students to use. The resources are organized chronologically by 16 different eras that I'm showing you now. And when you click into an era, and I'm going to go up to this early era because thinking that's probably where many of you are, you will see that there are 4 to 5 subtopics here. And these are just here to help you get to sort of the topic or the resource that you're looking for. So I'm going to pretend that I'm in this time period. It just pulls me down to those resources. And one thing that you'll see here is the type of resource is indicated here. So we have interactive images, interactive timelines, and interactive maps in the U.S. History Collection. We'll show you some of those. We have interactive lessons, which is a more robust and sort of complete interactive. And the bulk of the media in the U.S. History Collection is video-based. And our videos are generally between 3 and 6 minutes in length. We've been told by our teacher advisors that that's really a sweet spot for the classroom. We've also incorporated 9 different historical thinking skills into the collection. And we've aligned every resource in the collection to at least 2 skills. So you can browse the resources by skill. So let's say you want to work with your students on analyzing multiple perspectives. And let's say that you are in the run-up to the Civil War. Okay, so I've just clicked down into that area, that subtopic. And here I can see all of the resources that are in that time frame and that align with analyzing multiple perspectives. Oh, and here's one of John Brown. I just love John Brown. So I'm going to look at this one, and it sort of picks up on that really important, I think, question. How do we view someone like John Brown? Is he a martyr or is he a criminal? And this is a media gallery. So this has 4 very short videos. Each one sort of contributes to answering this topic or this sort of question. And then this resource also happens to come with a student activity. So here's that skill, analyzing multiple perspectives. And this begins with a brief introduction. Students are given an essential question that sort of frames this activity. And then they're given these step-by-step directions. So they watch the videos. They then have an image to analyze here. This is one image of John Brown, kind of a saintly image here, and some image analysis questions to answer. Then they're given a very different image of John Brown, little crazy, a little turbulent here, and some more image analysis questions here. And then they return to the essential question and are asked to answer a brief response there in the box. All right, so I'm going to go back to the slides here and turn things over.
Thank you so much, Sue. So tonight I wanted to tackle the issue of women and gender equality. This is something that obviously dominates the news cycle quite a bit. From thinking about pay equity today to access to healthcare, how we consider the role of women in our nation's history can be really difficult. It can be a hard balancing act, I think, sometimes for teachers. Oftentimes our textbooks are just dominated by the political acts of men. Women are viewed as passive recipients. And then oftentimes when women do make their entrance into the textbook, it's around the ideals or seeing them as somewhat monolithic. So maybe it's the concept of Republican motherhood, maybe it's looking at the cult of domesticity. And you kind of get the sense that women view issues similarly. Sometimes different perspectives or voices are allowed to happen in the narrative, but that tends to be a little bit more the exception, not always the norm. So the first strategy that I would like to address tonight and how to tackle challenging topics in the classroom is to start to widen our scope of who contributes to making history, and really to give intentional space to normalize the contributions of women, both collectively and individually. So I want to walk you through first a great example and a great resource to help kind of normalize the role of women. So if you haven't started it already, or maybe you're beginning your American Revolution unit in your classroom. So a great way to start it is not by discussing George Washington or common sense, but maybe you can use one of our interactive lessons to kick off the ways that women played a significant role in the American Revolution. Now, while Sue pulls up the interactive lesson, first and foremost, what I love about interactive lessons is that it's really hands-on for students. It's a way that really drives student inquiry because we never want to tell students what to think. We want to teach them how to think for themselves. And it's all self-guided, self-paced. It highlights vocabulary. It has places to take notes. It's a really great self-contained tool for teachers. So I want to walk you through this interactive lesson. It really enables students to learn about the ways in which a diverse group of women, including Black, Indigenous, and white women, contributed to the Revolutionary War efforts. And we're also going to introduce them to some individual women as well. So what this interactive lesson does is it really shows how women were just as fiercely invested in the revolutionary period as men were. So tonight I really want to consider the fact that women were the main purchasers of their households and were actually, in fact, the main drivers of early boycotts. Well, because they were the ones who bought the household goods. So women were completely central to the boycotts of British goods after the French and Indian War. And so one of the things to keep in mind, and I think it's important to share with your students, is when we think about maybe the Sugar Act of 1764, we kind of just say that there were new duties on imports and the colonists protested. But let's also think of how they practically protested. Okay, since women were in charge of buying what was needed for the family and the home, they chose what to purchase or not to purchase for the house. So what ended up happening was a lot of women got together to make their own clothing and to spin their own cloth and make their own clothing. And also, this came at a significant cost to them. It was time consuming, it was burdensome, but without their efforts to create homespun wool, boycotts on British goods would have failed. So we all know about the Boston Tea Party, and the events of December 16th really reverberated all their way throughout the country. One way was through North Carolina. There was a woman named Penelope Barker who organized her own protest. So she went door to door to incite women to support a boycott of English tea. So why I really love this example, and as one to show your students, is that these women drew up resolutions declaring their intention to boycott English tea and sent that all the way over to England, and that circulated all throughout England. It was published in newspapers throughout England and the colonies, and it met with a lot of strong reaction on both sides and was seen as a really strong demonstration of patriotism. And it was really the first time that women had taken this kind of political action in American history. But I think it also is important to show your students how that reaction was received. So here you can see a primary source image of an illustration that captures what happened at the Denton Tea Party. So I want you to take a quick second to look at this image and just drop in the chat what you see and how you think women were perceived for this event. So just take a second and look and see, okay, how are these women being perceived at the Denton Tea Party? And if you want to think and reflect on it, that works as well. Oh, so is this a sign of early influencers? So men are leaning in, or their perceptions of the way that they don't have the same role as men. So we have a lot of different things that are happening in this image. So are they neglecting their children? Are there ways that men are pursuing them? You also have this one, they're portrayed somewhat unflatteringly, or they don't like these advances. So yes, these are different ways that you can kind of, nuance the story as you're studying this with your students. As we go and make our way through the IL, what I really like about the stories here is that it gives women the same credibility that we'll get from the Washingtons and Jeffersons of our textbook. You have examples of women fighting on the battlefields. You have examples of women creating robust literature and political thought, like Mercy Otis Warren or Phyllis Wheatley. And you also have examples of women who come together to try to broker peace between nations. And finally, you have, I think this is one of my favorites, stories of both loyalists and patriots who acted as spies. So Benedict Arnold should not get the credit that he does in these textbooks. It was in fact Peggy Shippen, his wife, who got him to become a spy, as she was a spy herself. So next slide, please. At the end of your interactive lesson, what you can do is you can have students return to their work and answer the essential question. And again, teach this in tandem with the rest of your curriculum. Next, I want to show you another image. I'm juxtaposing two images here right now. So to our left, in more recent history, we have the 2017 Women's March, which was the day after the presidential inauguration when women came out to demonstrate. So angered by the language of the presidential campaign and worried about a new political culture that might rise, laden with misogyny, hundreds of thousands of women took to the streets in the nation's capital, and millions more joined in sister marches across the globe. Similarly, in 1913, women also took to the streets of Washington, D.C. to upstage a presidential inauguration. New President Woodrow Wilson was coming into office, and the day before his inauguration, thousands of women marched along Pennsylvania Avenue, the same route that the inaugural parade would take the next day. This was the first civil rights march on Washington, D.C. So the parade was meant to introduce a new activism, energy, tactics in the languishing women's suffrage movement. It garnered national attention, both planned for and unexpected. So without calling for direct patterns or even similar parallels between these two events, I just wanted to put these two pictures side by side to invite you to reflect on the 2017 Women's March and think about it within the context of the women's suffrage movement. Next slide. So first and foremost, I invite you to take a second to answer the following question in the chat. When you hear United States women's suffrage movement, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? So again, when you hear United States women's suffrage movement, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? Voting rights. Alice Paul, voting rights, ERA. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, World War I. Excellent, the fight for equality. So I love that you've pointed out a lot of excellent figures, events, timeframes. Awesome. So what I really want to do for the rest of my time tonight is really look at the nuances of women's suffrage in the United States. I think oftentimes it's taught in a very linear fashion and it's taught in between other events that happened. But what I really want to do is grapple with its nuances, break it apart, and really examine all of these levels. I think we've already talking about, oh, thank you, Andrea, talking about the racism and segregation within the movement. So before we dive in, I want to show you the introductory video to one of our resources called She Resisted. So this is Strategies of Suffrage. So we're just going to play the opening video. Awesome. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I love about this interactive is how, again, it really centers on that student inquiry, that student exploration, and on critical thinking. So what students can do in this interactive is that they can really learn about all of the different strategies that the suffrage movement used to try to gain the right to vote or take the right to vote. So from speaking in the streets to creating propaganda to picketing and risking and being imprisoned and going on hunger strikes. So again, I just really kind of want to focus on that it wasn't simply taking to the streets. It was incredibly organized. It was very purposeful in the way that it went to capture attention. One of the ways that it worked to capture attention was through the strategy of pageants. And what I love about this example is it really talks about the way that Alice Paul was looking to use symbolism throughout the movement. And she was very careful and knew what she was doing in trying to garner national attention. So in creating this pageant for 1913, before Wilson's inauguration, I love this quote from Alice Paul. When you're presenting something to the world, make it as beautiful as you can. It's a great message to take, especially in terms of optimism. The last image that I want to show you in this interactive is actually what happened on the front page of the Washington Post. Paul got exactly what she wanted. She upstaged the president by forcing his inauguration to share the same space with her. So just think about that for a second and bring that concept to your students. What would it mean for a president to share that same space? So again, I just want to consider for a moment the essential question of this resource. Do we want to think about women gaining the right to vote or women taking the right to vote? How does that wording change our reflection of the suffrage movement? Why do they need multiple strategies and strong organization to succeed? What maybe parallels can students draw between the Women's March and the fight for suffrage? So while the suffrage movement was well devised, it was carefully planned, it took decades, again, the movement was not monolithic. Women were absolutely divided in the paths they wanted to take to secure the right to vote. So one of the ways that we want to help your students through challenging times is to invite them opportunities to practice civil discourse. So this resource, Divided Tactics in Pursuit of the 19th Amendment, talks about the split between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul as they were trying to intensify their pressure on Woodrow Wilson. And which avenues do you take? Do you support the president who's on the brink of war, or do you continue to picket, continue to protest, continue to fight for the amendment? So Catt and Paul bitterly disagreed over strategy. So next slide, please. One of the ways that you can invite students to start to think about civil discourse is for them to imagine conversation between Paul and Chapman Catt, who we knew absolutely did not like each other and did not agree. But I think it's really important for students to think, what were the differing tactics they had? Where might they actually potentially find places for agreement? And then can you have students write a mock dialogue between the two? I see where you're coming from, but I do not agree. I agree with you because, or we have disagreement over because, and have them consider for themselves which strategies of suffrage do they agree with and why. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Let's head back to the resource. My apologies. So I came up in the chat. I'm really excited that some of you mentioned this already, but also the women's suffrage movement was bitterly divided on terms of race. And so this is an excellent resource that really walks students through the way that the 15th Amendment divided the women's suffrage movement and siphoned off female African-American participation in suffrage. So once the 15th Amendment was going to exclude women, it really became a wedge issue, and it caused huge friction and opposition. And so what I just wanted to show quickly is how this resource centers on Ida B. Wells, who was absolutely instrumental in trying to advocate for women and advocate for the Black right to vote. And really, it was through her power and an incredible aggressive grassroots movement that she did that really brought and harnessed African-American female political power in Chicago. And it actually in 1914 got an African-American alderman elected. Lastly, the last resource I want to walk you through is a way to end on hope and resilience when things look like they're incredibly splintered, like maybe there's no hope or path forward. This is a different resource with a different perspective. And it talks about the way that female circus performers advocated for the right to vote. And what's really interesting is that the circus offered an opportunity for equity for women. They had pay equity, they had the same opportunities that male performers had, and they were female performers were able to become incredibly outspoken and powerful advocates for women's suffrage. So in fact, they were actually offered the circus tent as a way to get their powerful message of suffrage across to their audiences. So again, that Friday afternoon ending with a place where equity is possible and can happen. We also have support materials. You can go through these resources and see we have independent student activities that help walk students through all of these topics, again, through deep inquiry. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. So I'd like to talk to you about Reconstruction. Reconstruction can also be considered a challenging subject to teach, and many educators in schools simply kind of steer clear of the subject to avoid any real controversy. However, that's the wrong avenue to take. According to a Times article last year, January 12th, it said that social studies standards for over 45 out of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, the discussion of Reconstruction was partial or just simply non-existent. And historians actually have expressed concern that American children will grow up to be uninformed about a critical period of history. That really helps to explain why full racial equality remains unfulfilled today. And oftentimes, if we do teach about it, a lot of times teachers kind of like want to, err on the side of caution and strictly teach about the occurrences during Reconstruction on the federal level. Next slide. David Blight, one of my favorite historians out there, he really made a good point about this. He said, Reconstruction is a part of American history that really isn't easy to face. It tells us that we had a moment in our history when our politics broke down, our society broke down, our police power broke down. The government wasn't functioning sufficiently enough to protect one group of citizens from another who simply engaged in wanton vigilante violence of the worst kind. And he's definitely right on that. Next slide. Well, the dangers of neglecting teaching Reconstruction really hit home for me. A couple of years ago, during the height of the pandemic, I agreed to teach a summer course on history of voting rights for the Gilder Lehrman, and I had a student, all my students were supposed to be doing reflections at the end of every lesson. And so when we did a lesson on Reconstruction, I had one student who posted her reflection, and it moved me. She was a student, I believe, in a northern state, and she basically said, some highlights from her reflection. My 8th grade U.S. history course only covered up to the Civil War, so I'm rather ignorant on Reconstruction onward. I always thought that the Emancipation Proclamation was the end-all, be-all for institutional inequality, but it's always been drilled into my brain that the Civil War ended all racism. I subconsciously thought that oppression stopped during Reconstruction and just magically materialized in time for the Civil Rights Movement of 1964. When I saw that, even though, like I said, I only had the student for the summer, that really gave me pause on just how important teaching Reconstruction really is. Next slide. So how can we begin? I wanted to give you some specific tips that you could use and strategies that you could immediately tomorrow bring into your classroom to begin the discussion of this very difficult topic, but essential. The first one is, we need to be able to offer means of communication and a small group activities. Start out by giving the students a series of images to analyze, primary source images. And you can ask your students, based upon the evaluation of these sources and what you have learned about the Civil War, ask your students to, come up with, in small groups, what are 5 to 7 rights Black people should be awarded because they earned immediately following the Civil War. That could be a gateway into this discussion. Next slide. The next thing that you could do is have students then explore what Black people actually received on the federal level. And one of the main critiques, like we said, that we hear around the country is that some parents are afraid that white students are going to feel guilty for the acts of what other white people did to them. However, I challenge you to really think about that. All right, let's not assume as educators that if we do have white students in our classrooms that they're going to automatically identify with white pro-slavery supporters. For example, when you're teaching about like the Reconstruction amendments that were granted by the federal government, definitely take time to identify those white Republicans that were advocating for Black equality. The only caution that I will say with this is that while you're doing this, make sure you're cognizant of the fact that you don't make them the center of the discussion. All right, because then that kind of falls right back into what we've done in the past. And, you know, by doing that, that could be one way to make sure that none of your students feel singled out or alienated. Next slide. As suggested in our guidelines in the very beginning of our seminar, we also said that, you know, bringing in individualized stories really helps students. And it's a very effective strategy for helping to personalize the information for our students. Don't just tell them about the changes that were made on the federal level, but show them with some real life stories. One of the resources we have on PBS Learning really helps us to identify some of the Black men that were elected into Congress. So many of our students have no clue that around 2,000 African Americans actually held political positions before the end of Reconstruction. And not only that, in some places like South Carolina, you even had a Black majority in their state legislature. Next slide. However, like I said, the story is not complete, and it's definitely misrepresented if we only talk about what happened on the federal level. Because if you look at what happened on the federal level, there's lots of things to celebrate, you know, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. But we have to actually also take a look at what happened on that state level. You know, so our students can really see Reconstruction through multiple perspectives, and, you know, one that was full of diverse experiences. So like what I like to do for you right now is that we have a really awesome, it's a short introduction into the Black codes that you saw that were passed in the state level. And we're going to play just a couple snippets for you, and then we'll come on back and discuss how can we use this in the classroom.
In November of 1865, the government that Andrew Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that oppressed African Americans. Soon, other southern states followed suit. These laws became known as the Black Codes.
The basic purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery has been abolished, but to make sure that there is as little change from slavery to freedom as possible.
The key to the Black Codes was what they called vagrancy laws, things like that. Every adult Black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant, and they could be fined, and if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine, and then they'd have to work off the fine for that person.
What's even worse than being arrested if you don't have a job is having your children taken away. So your neighbor down the road can go to the courts and say, John Jones, you know, he can't take care of his children. He's indigent, but I'll take them in. And I will train them in farming methods, or I'll train the daughters in housewifery. And I will have their labor, and the parents will get a little bit of money at the end of their period of indenture. But Black parents didn't have a say in this.
A lot of parents are fighting back and saying, no, they don't want their children to be apprenticed. They can take care of them. They also know that in apprenticeship conditions, they can't protect their children from physical and sexual abuse. It becomes a way for the planter class to continue stealing the labor of the children, and sometimes stealing the children themselves.
Thank you. Every time I watch that documentary, it just kind of gives me chills. And when I show it in my class, my students, you can hear a pin drop. What I love about this resource is that you saw the goats there, right? You know, you saw powerhouses like Henry Louis Gates. You can hear him. Eric Foner, who I call just the OG of Reconstruction history, and the other, the young lady, the woman that was talking about the apprentice system. I'm just very, very well versed in this particular topic. And I want to take a tip from the chat. What's status in here. She says she was talking about kind of being, in a rural area and it's very difficult teaching the subject, and stick to the facts. And that's exactly what this resource does. And it's our recommendation. All right, let the primary sources speak for themselves. And then more importantly, have students, give them an opportunity to make comparisons. We actually have this worksheet available along with the resource that as the students are watching the film or even afterwards, you can have them reflect and try to see what were the similarities between life under the Black codes and life under slavery. Was it really that different? They're also in the form of graphic organizers, which really helps with your struggling readers. And then probably what's even more powerful is right there at the bottom. We give our students an opportunity to be able to develop a claim supported by evidence that also includes a counterclaim. This is very important, particularly in these very challenging times for our students to be able to, have a claim, but also make sure their claim is supported by evidence and acknowledge, any weak points of their evidence or any part where someone might be able to counter them. All right, next slide. I would also suggest to personalize their learning experience, right? That's one of our guidelines. Have the students, go to this website from my former alma mater, Florida Atlantic University. They actually have a really cool resource here where you can actually go to this website and it has a list of a lot of the states that had Black codes. I know that a lot of us are able to go to our local libraries to get it, but if you don't have the time, you can go here, you can look for your state and have your students research what were the Black codes in the states that they live in, all right? Another way to let the sources kind of speak for themselves. If I wanted to know about Maryland, where I'm currently living, even though I teach in DC, a whole list of the Maryland Black codes were on this website. And if I were teaching in schools, I could have my students, these laws deal with education, they deal with transportation, it deals with prison sentences, and it also deals with relationship statuses. So once again, personalizing it. And then you can have the students go back to the warm-up that I introduced you all to, and now have the students say, hey, that list that you came up of what you believe that Black people should get, what they did earn during Reconstruction, and let's take a look at actually what did happen in the end, and have the students really kind of compare and contrast, and maybe even come up with their own understanding of Reconstruction or their own claim about life during this period. Next slide. And so this actually kind of lends us to another very important topic, was the teaching, voting rights can be very controversial in today's time. And what we could do with this one is it's a great way to start out with the warm up. And what I like to do in my class is I'll ask them in the form of kind of like a classroom discussion, what's the definition of democracy? What rights should be guaranteed under democratic government? How easy should it be to vote in a democratic society? And to what extent can a society be considered a democracy if not all groups have equal access to voting? So I usually kind of begin with that discussion. And then, however, I kind of set the parameters. As we discuss it, you have to frame your questions using these sentence starters. Just like Lindsay had spoke before, I see where you're coming from, but I do not agree that. I agree with you because we have disagreement over because, and that kind of really helps set the stage for a civil discussion. If anytime a student wants to jump in and interject, if they're not following the sentence framework, I'll actually stop and say, reframe that using our sentence starters to make sure it's within the parameters. Next slide. So after you do that, you can then move into a comprehensive study of the history of voting rights. We have a great resource for that that takes into account multiple perspectives, which is very important, and the inclusion of diverse experiences. Next slide. We also have a great independent student activity that helps guide the students through this resource as well. So we know that they're learning as they're watching, and we're asking good comprehension questions to make sure we're kind of veering them off, formulating a precise narrative. And then as you do that, all right, the next resource that really lends itself well is what's the deal with modern day voting rights? All right, we have independent student activity that really kind of, it goes into exactly the state of voting rights today. It talks about, why doesn't everyone have a voter registration card or, ID laws? It talks about civil rights laws today, currently with voting rights laws. It gives statistics. It gives kind of like the main argument surrounding some of the new state laws that have been passed regarding, showing ID to be able to vote. And it's got a great reading resource that goes along with it that also can be used. And then, once you're done with that, ladies and gentlemen, the next thing that you could do, next slide, is you can kind of close this out with an exit activity, a PBS seminar. Remember, safely in, safely out. Don't just show the kids this information and say, all right, see you all later, but also, kind of like help them bring it to a close. You can take the same questions that you introduced to them as a warm-up after they've watched the video, after they've read the background information, after they've done that comprehensive history of voting rights and what's going on today with voter ID laws and kind of the controversy behind them. Present those same questions to them and see if their position has shifted or changed now that they actually have the facts. And then once again, you make sure that they answer along the safe parameters of sentence starters to make sure it's civil. And then I always like to ask like 2 additional reflection questions at the end. So in addition to the original, how easy should it be to vote in a democratic society? To what extent can society be considered a democracy if not all groups have equal access to voting? Ask them, how did this lesson impact your initial feelings about the subject and why? And then ask them, why is it important to have multiple perspectives when understanding history and current events and policies? Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Sue.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. So the last topic we're going to touch on tonight is Indigenous peoples' history. And again, this came through in a lot of your questions in your registrations. So when I was in the classroom, I was committed to teaching Indigenous peoples' history, and yet I found it the most challenging history to teach. I did not feel I had the right resources, but didn't really know where to find them. I always felt like I was teaching a view of Indigenous people more as victims, and I really struggled to bring their history into the 21st century. And it turns out that my challenges actually were not unique. This comes from a research article, which I believe we've shared with you. And you can see that the challenges that many, many teachers face, despite very, very good intentions. So there are over 566 federally recognized American Indian tribes in the United States. That doesn't even begin to count the state and local tribes. State history standards still sort of emphasize this Eurocentric view of Native peoples as uncivilized and victimized. They're often presented as bystanders instead of as active participants. And the chronology often sort of ends around 1900 or so, and then they sort of disappear from history. So some recommendations here to really, I think, just to sort of give yourselves grace, first of all, and to not assume that you can sort of fix this overnight, but I think that these are some very doable things that you could start with this year. So first, to extend the chronology and try and bring it into the 20th and 21st century. And we have some resources that could help you do that. Try to get specific, have students learn specific names of tribes and nations, and find out what is your department's or your district's policy. What nomenclature are they using, and bring that into the classroom. Add personal histories to create greater understanding and empathy. We know that personal histories humanize historical actors for students. As we've been saying all along, try to add in multiple perspectives and Indigenous narratives where possible, so that you're moving away from that Eurocentric framework. And try to emphasize active participation and agency rather than victimization. So I know that's maybe easier said than done, but I do think these resources could help you with that. So this is one of our most popular interactive lessons. It's a fairly standard topic. It may be one that many of you teach, but this resource incorporates multiple perspectives. It shows how the exchange impacted both sides of the Atlantic. So it wasn't a takeover. It wasn't a one-way street. It was truly an exchange. This is a great resource, actually, if you're teaching the history of Pilgrims and the first encounter. It positions the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims on equal footing when discussing the alliance that they formed. It was actually a mutual security pact for both groups, as they were both struggling to survive at that time. This video also discusses how little the historical record contains about the first Thanksgiving, noting that no one at the time called it Thanksgiving. And there are two Indigenous scholars in this clip from the film that lend their insights and expertise to correcting the historical record. All right, now I'm moving in chronological order as well here. So I'm going to take you now. Let me see, where is this? Here we go. So I'm going to take you to this resource. This is an interactive image, and we're now in the American Revolution, and so little attention is given to the roles played by different groups, like Native Americans. Or if they're given attention, they're often portrayed as passive and simply waiting to be impacted by the war's effects. This resource takes what might be a familiar image to many of you. Maybe you've even used it before with your students. And it highlights the diversity of colonists and the diverse experiences during the Revolution. So if you're looking at this image, I'm wondering, can you locate the Native American in the picture? And while you're looking carefully there, can you find the woman? And can you find the Black sailor? So down here, you'll see these different buttons. So I'll click on the people, and here they are highlighted for you and students. And when you click into what we call hotspots, it pulls up a page with additional information. So this page talks about Native Americans in the Revolutionary War. There's also an introduction to the painting, and this gives students historical background on the painting and the artist. And this resource also comes with a student activity that we talked about earlier. I'm just going to move along just for the, because I know we're pressed for time. So you can talk about active participation and, oh, sorry, wait a minute, I think I skipped over. Here we go. I do want to talk about this resource. This particular resource is written specifically for younger students. If we have middle school teachers in the audience, this would be a great resource for you to use. And it teaches students about the conflicting views of land and land ownership and how that led to conflict between the white settlers and Indigenous people. I know that many teachers teach Cherokee removal, and we have several resources to assist you with that. I particularly like this one, The Trail of Tears, and We Shall Remain. It highlights the change in federal policy from Jefferson to Jackson. It describes the actual removal, and it really doesn't shy away from its deadly consequences. There is a great student background reading with this resource that looks at the active steps that Cherokee leaders took to resist removal. So again, you know, as it says here, agency and activism don't always lead to success, but that doesn't mean that the Cherokee were passive and didn't do what they could to resist removal. And there's also a student activity that helps students with this resource as well. All right, let me move along here. And then we talked about adding personal stories that humanize and create empathy. And these are just a few examples of resources we have that do that. The one on the far right, if you teach about the Native American boarding schools and the forced assimilation policy, this is a resource that would really help put a personal spin on that, because the people being interviewed were children and they lived through that experience. And the last resource I'm going to share with you tries to bring the history into the more current day. And these two resources do a really good job of extending the chronology. This one on the left, Occupation of Alcatraz, actually makes a very direct connection between current day protests and this event in 1969, which Indigenous people refer to as their March on Washington. All right, and that wraps things up for us. I know we've shared a lot with you in a short amount of time. Please feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat, and we will get you an answer. And also, maybe you'd like to tell us, like, what's one takeaway from tonight's webinar. You could put that in the chat as well. We'd appreciate it. Thanks so much. And I'm going to turn things over to Carolyn.
And I think I'll quote a few people in the chat. Wow. Really nice job, ladies, and so many resources to share. As we were going through it, I realized that I missed a few resources in the resource document that I've been posting in the chat, and you'll get the link to that also tomorrow. But it's a living document on Google Drive, and I'll be adding to it. And I think I'll even go through the chat and pull out some of the resources that you're mentioning and sharing them also. So thank you very much. We're winding down. I just have a few reminders at the end, and then the presenters will be looking in the chat, and we'll try and get to some more of your questions. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder that what you saw tonight is on pbslearningmedia.org, a free website, and the U.S. History Collection is there, as well as thousands of other resources. And we're very strong in social studies, so please check out the site. Next slide, please. This is just to highlight that we know and love the U.S. History Collection, but it's not the only collection on PBS Learning Media. There is a collection from American Experience, from Frontline, and Life During World War II, a collection of using artifacts to understand history, is also very near and dear to Sue Wilkins, because she was part of the production and bringing that to us when she was director of the World War II Museum. So there are hundreds of collections on the site. One of the tips we have is that if you're a newbie to PBS Learning Media, when you go to the site, you can filter your search by collections. And that is a good way to start kind of getting familiar with the site. Okay, next slide. We do a lot of webinars, and we've had many around the U.S. History Collection prior to it being fully launched and after it was launched in December of 2022. And these are some of the titles, and all of the links to the recordings and the resource documents are in that resource document that I mentioned. So each of these webinars has their own resource document, and they're all recorded. And all of the recordings of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel, and you see the link up there. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to call attention to our most recent webinar that we had in January, and the recording link in the resource document for that, because civil rights was mentioned as one of the topics that really is of interest to you. And so I wanted to call attention to that. Next slide, please. All right, this is very important. The Busing Battleground and the Harvest are two American Experience programs that will premiere right after Labor Day, one on September 11th and the other on September 12th on your local PBS station. And at the same time of broadcast, they're going to be streaming on all of the PBS myriad of platforms that we have. These are both based on incidents in the 1970s. The busing battle took place in Boston, in obviously a northern urban setting. And the Harvest is based around a small rural community in Mississippi. They both center around the complex topic and legacy, and very troubling legacy, of school desegregation more than 20 years after the Brown decision. So I encourage you to, if you're able to, watch them when they're broadcast, or again, there will be many opportunities to see them. Next slide. All right, this is the slide that has the links. Take a picture of it. I've been putting this list also in the chat, and you will get this in the follow-up email that comes to you from Zoom tomorrow. It comes in the evening. It comes to everyone who registered, and we encourage you to share it with your colleagues also. Next slide. All right, I'm Carolyn Jacobs, and I invite you to be in touch with me with any comments or questions you have. I'll get them to the right person. and we can stop sharing and go on camera, and we have about 5 minutes. If there are questions that we want to address in the chat, or someone wants to post something or let us know what your takeaway is. I did notice in the beginning that there were some questions around strategies for EL students and also strategies for differentiating the interactive lessons. So if either of you wanted to comment on that, that might get us started.
Yeah, I think that, our media is actually really accessible for EL students because it's so image driven. When you get into the collection, you'll see that, it could be video, but it could also just be a historical image. And you can just project that. And that's that's a very sort of accessible way, not just for EL learners, but for all learners, I think. Also, our videos come with transcripts. Our videos all have closed captioning. Our videos also can be played at different speeds. So if you need to slow it down, it doesn't degrade the quality of the video. It just slows it down. So I know that's not a perfect fix, but those are some of the ways that we try to support EL learners.
Yeah, I just want to say in my classroom, that's exactly what I do. When I do show the PBS LearningMedia resources, I do slow the setting down, particularly if I have a lot of students where English is not their first language. I also have copies of the transcript that I do provide. I do sometimes take the transcript and print it out ahead of time, and I'll actually use Google Translate to change to put it in their language, so that they can, read it ahead of time and then follow along. And Sue is also very correct in the fact that a lot of what we do is image driven. It's the images that really do help them and help bridge the language divide. Also, a lot of our resources, they are in the form of graphic organizers, and we said that graphic organizers were very important in the sense that it does help your slower readers and also people where English is not their first language as well. I did see a question about the use of the word slave versus enslaved. A lot of our almost all of our resources use the term enslaved versus slave, and just once you explain it to the students. I like to kind of preface it whenever I start a lesson. I like to tackle the language, acceptable language that's used. And that's kind of like one of the groundworks that I do when we do talk about slavery, the use of enslaved versus slave. And then whenever students, they're speaking, getting them into the habit, if they slip and say slave, I'll usually say, oh, you mean the enslaved? And that kind of helps as well. Okay.
There was also a question that was sent to the panelists, kind of asking, how do you treat history in kind of a nuanced way, especially when you consider the way that people of color have been treated throughout American history? So I just wanted to make sure that you can take the time and really say to your students that it is not an either or issue. It is complicated, and it's okay to sit in complicated. In history, we don't want to look for a right or wrong answer. We're not solving a math problem. We are really looking again at a diverse experience of a lot of different groups of people. And we really want to make sure that we're bringing together those stories to tell a complicated picture of American history. So yes, we can look and share the same facts. I think we can always delve into the primary sources and use that as a standing point to really see, okay, what were these lived experiences like? What did they take away? What were moments of joy? What were moments of empowerment? And what were also moments where people were not treated well by other people? And I think, again, if you can kind of open up those conversations, don't make it about an either or, make it about kind of larger shades of gray, a continuum, and really challenge your students to look that way.
Okay.
All right, we need to wind down, but I want to give people a chance to post their reactions in the chat, and we will go through the chat transcript carefully and get back to some people individually, and I'll pass questions along to the presenters because all of your comments and questions are very important.
There's so many good questions here.
So that's actually a real pleasure of mine, is to go through the chat and divide things up and highlight things and get back in touch with people. So, okay, we'll keep the chat open just for another minute or so. I know that it's late and people are tired, and Alicia's second day of school, you need to get some rest, along with the rest of you. We do have other webinars that are coming up this fall and also next year, of course. And by virtue of being here, you will be on our mailing list, and we'll make sure that you are notified of things. So thank you, ladies, and thank you all teachers for all the work that you do and for joining us this evening.